The East has some pretty extreme history, but European history is interesting for sure.
There's something about white males where they're more inclined to take a risk. That's like you have Asians tend to have higher IQs than whites, but you have all these inventions. You have all these inventions coming from whites, despite not being the smartest ones. And I think it's a combination of like gumption and grit and risk taking, and it just leads to more inventions. Well,
I think it was. I know that you probably know.
Chinese
E. Michael Jones, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Well, E. Michael Jones has a hypothesis about this, which is kind of interesting. So, white cultures themselves are kind of young, right? They're actually kind of young. The European nations were basically all barbarians, and that's what the Romans called them, barbarians, because they went blah blah blah, right? That's why they called them barbarians. Yeah, that's why the Romans and the Greeks called them barbarians. Blah blah blah. That's what they thought they sounded like. Thought they sounded like idiots, and they lived in forests, the European forests, basically. Yeah. Once there was a move through to kind of culture the barbarians, they had all this natural resource around them. Massive forests. Some of these trees were, you never find anything like it. Again, all of Europe was a giant forest. So they had huge industry. They were able to kind of move into huge industry because they had a lot of resources. And so kind of the Jones hypothesis on this is Africans are way behind because they didn't have all of this access to resource for industry. There's just really nothing there in sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas in Europe, when the barbarian tribes which were there get domesticated, they had tons and tons of resources, and so they became very inventive.
But isn't the whole hypothesis about race and IQ that people in Africa had it easier? So they didn't have to survive, whereas whites had to survive the Siberian winters, and they got better at systems because they had to like pickle things and plan for the winter and insulate a home and have firewood for the winter months, but no one else really had to plan that far ahead.
So that's, if we're looking from kind of a purely evolutionary lens, which is what you're kind of looking at. Not really. That wouldn't really be the hypothesis because they also weren't getting run down by lions and tigers, and they also weren't, having nearly as much trouble.
Well, blacks can run fast.
So because of whites, right? But yes, Africa had all sorts of conditions that they were dealing with there that were every bit as bad as the conditions dealt with by these northern tribes, right? Same thing. They had all sorts of bad conditions, but they didn't have nearly as much in the way of naturalized resources which were useful. They had those things that nobody cared about then, right? If you're tribal, like gold and diamonds and rubies, right? Nobody cared about those things.
Those are rocks.
Yeah, those are dumb glittery rocks. We can't eat that. You know what I mean?
Well, why do you? Because I don't think it's arguable that whites are, especially males, are exceptionally good at systems. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because Christianity.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I agree with the Jones hypothesis that. So, well, the interesting thing about Christianity is you can take this kind of cross ethnos. You can say, yeah, the Scottish are a lot like the Irish. They're not Irish. And they're not English. And the English and the Scottish and the Irish have fought a lot of wars against each other.
Yeah.
They've done it tons and tons and tons.
600 years.
Yeah, but they have this great unification, right, that happened throughout all of Europe called Christianity. And there was a synergistic relationship between the church and the state. Well, the church itself, it had churches that it was the head of in all of these different countries, in England and in France. And it was all the Catholic Church, one church under one head. So it was really easy to communicate between these different nations for diplomacy, things like this. So systems gradually expanded from that.
Viking women. On leaving his farm or estate for any length of time, the freeman would make a public show of handing over the keys of the house to his wife, a sign that she was in absolute charge of all things in his absence. Those keys would be added to the bunch of keys that, as a married woman, she always carried on her person, the most important of which secured the chests containing the family's most precious possessions. In almost every respect, women in Viking society held equal status with their men. Even when the freeman was at home, it was his wife who had complete authority over all household matters and supervised the thralls and free servants who would assist her with daily tasks such as spinning, weaving, stitching, brewing drink, and preparing food. From an early age, Viking women were encouraged to be self-reliant and resourceful. An Icelandic law set the earliest marrying age for girls at 12 years, and in outlying farming communities, those marriages would usually be arranged by families. On occasion, however, women were free to choose their own husbands. They were also entitled to own property and inherit wealth in their own right. If necessary, a woman could sue for divorce, and when she left, could claim back her dowry and a share of the household goods. If a woman was widowed, she was allowed the dignity of deciding whether to remarry or retain her independence. That these women were imbued with a strong sense of their own worth and could become influential and wealthy figures in Viking society is evident from the quality of their grave goods and the respectful manner in which they were interred. According to the skalds and poets, some Viking women could be forceful to the point of violence, and the sagas are peppered with references to feisty, strong-minded matriarchs who would pursue blood feuds and galvanize their men-folk into action. The exploits of one of these women, Fritis, the daughter of Erik the Red, have come down to us in the Groenlandinga, or Greenlanders, saga, and the saga of Erik the Red. In the account given in the Greenlanders saga, Fritis and her husband Thorvard, in partnership with two brothers named Helgi and Finnbogi, set sail from Greenland in 2 ships on a profit-sharing expedition to Vinland. Having arrived safely, Fritis hatches a scheme to take over the ship belonging to the 2 brothers and tricks her husband into slaying both them and their crew. When Thorvard shrinks from killing 5 women who had accompanied Helgi and Finnbogi, Fritis takes up an axe and finishes the job herself. While this is no doubt an extreme example of a Viking woman's behavior, it is nevertheless a clear indication that some women were not averse to voyaging across dangerous seas on trading expeditions with their husbands and were entitled to share in any profit that was forthcoming.